Welcome back. In this video, I want to bring together the last big idea from this chapter, purchasing power parity, or PPP. Now, you have actually seen PPP before in this course. Earlier, when we talked about GDP and living standards across countries, we used PPP to make more meaningful comparisons. The reason is simple. If I only convert income using the market exchange rate, I may miss the fact that prices are very different across countries. A dollar equivalent income in one country may buy much more or much less than the same dollar equivalent income somewhere else. So the basic idea of PPP should already feel a little familiar to you. It is about purchasing power. It is about what money can actually buy. In this chapter, I want to come back to PPP from a different angle. Now we are not using PPP mainly to compare living standards. Now we are using it to think about currencies, prices, and exchange rates. That is why this topic connects so nicely to what we did earlier. In both cases, the key question is the same. What can a unit of currency actually buy? And that is also why PPP is closely related to the idea of the real exchange rate. Both are trying to help us think about the relationship between currencies, prices, and the cost of goods across countries. So the big question for today is this: what should determine the exchange rate between two currencies in the long run? PPP gives us one possible answer. Let's start with the basic logic behind PPP. PPP begins with a very simple idea called the law of one price. The law of one price says that the same good should sell for the same price in different places, once we account for the exchange rate. Why? Because if the same good were much cheaper in one place than in another, people would have an incentive to buy it where it is cheap and sell it where it is expensive. That is the basic arbitrage story. Let me give you a simple example. Suppose the exact same phone sells for much less in one country than in another, even after you convert the currencies. If that price difference is big enough, traders would want to buy phones in the cheaper market and sell them in the more expensive market. As that happens, demand rises in the cheaper market, so the price there tends to go up. At the same time, supply rises in the more expensive market, so the price there tends to go down. So the gap starts to close. That is the key intuition. If identical goods can move across markets, large price differences should not last. That is the starting point for PPP. Now let's take that one step further. Purchasing power parity says that a unit of currency should have the same purchasing power in all countries. In other words, once we take exchange rates into account, the same amount of money should be able to buy the same quantity of goods in different countries. That is the basic theory. Here is an easy way to think about it. Suppose one basket of goods is much more expensive in one country than in another, even after converting the currencies. Then one of the currencies is not lined up very well with what goods actually cost. PPP says the exchange rate should adjust so that the purchasing power becomes more similar across countries. So this theory is not really about money by itself. It is about what money can buy. That is why the name matters. Purchasing power parity means equality in purchasing power. And that is also why PPP is such a useful idea in international economics. It gives us a way to connect exchange rates to prices. Now let's talk about what PPP implies for exchange rates. If PPP holds, then the exchange rate between two currencies should reflect the difference in price levels between the two countries. The basic intuition is straightforward. If prices rise a lot in one country while prices in another country stay relatively stable, then the currency of the high-price country should lose value over time. Why? Because if goods become much more expensive in one country, but the exchange rate does not change, then that country's goods would become very expensive relative to foreign goods. PPP says the exchange rate should adjust to reflect those price differences. Here is a simple example. Suppose inflation is much higher in one country than in another for a long period of time. Goods in the high inflation country become more expensive. PPP suggests that this country's currency should depreciate in the long run. So, one important lesson from PPP is this: higher inflation tends to be associated with currency depreciation in the long run. That does not mean the adjustment happens instantly, but it does give us a very useful long run way to think about exchange rates. Now, I also want to be very clear about something. PPP is a useful idea, but it is not a perfect rule for the real world, and the reasons are actually not hard to understand. First, many goods and services are not easily traded across countries. Think about haircuts, apartment rent, local transportation, or restaurant meals. These are not like phones or wheat. You cannot easily ship them across borders and arbitrage them the same way. Second, even tradable goods are not always exactly the same. Transportation costs matter, taxes matter, tariffs matter, regulations matter, brand differences matter. Let me give you a very simple example. A cup of coffee may cost much more in one country than in another, but that does not automatically mean something is wrong with the theory. Part of that difference may come from rent, wages, taxes, or the fact that the local service experience is not exactly the same product everywhere. So, PPP works better as a broad long run benchmark than as a perfect short run rule. It helps us organize our thinking, but it does not mean every price is equalized across countries all the time. So let's finish with the main idea from today. PPP starts with the law of one price. If identical goods are traded freely, large price differences should create arbitrage, and that should push prices toward equality once we account for the exchange rate. PPP takes that basic idea and applies it more broadly. It says exchange rates should move in a way that makes purchasing power comparable across countries. That is why PPP is so useful. It helps us think about the long run relationship between exchange rates and price levels. But I also want you to remember its limits. PPP is not exact in the short run, and it does not work equally well for all goods and services. So, this is the best way to think about it. PPP is a powerful benchmark, not a perfect description of reality. If you remember that, then you will understand both why economists use PPP and why they also use it carefully.